The morning of September 19th, 1944, broke with a damp, clinging chill over the fields near Arracourt, France. Inside the cramped fighting compartment of his Panzer V, the Panther, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, felt the familiar thrum of the Maybach engine through the steel floor plates. It was a comforting, powerful vibration, the heartbeat of a predator. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, hot metal, and the wet earth of Lorraine. Through his periscope, the world was a narrow slice of grey mist and dripping trees. For Klaus, a veteran hardened by the endless plains of the Eastern Front, this was just another day. He and his crew were masters of their craft, members of the Panzer elite who had faced down hundreds of Soviet T-34 They trusted their machine implicitly. The Panther's thick, sloped frontal armour had proven virtually immune to enemy fire, and its long-barreled 75mm Quit K-42 cannon could kill anything the Allies could field from well over a kilometre away. They were knights in steel steeds, and they believed, with the certainty of men who had survived hell, that they were invincible. The Americans, they had been told, were a different sort of enemy, not the fanatical horde of the Soviets, but a soft industrial power that churned out mediocre tanks in vast numbers. They had encountered the Shermans, of course, flimsy, high-profile vehicles that the Germans grimly nicknamed Ronsons, because they had a tendency to brew up with a single, well-placed shot. The Americans had numbers, yes, but German quality, German doctrine, and German courage would always carry the day. That was the unwavering belief. As the mist began to thin, revealing the gentle undulations of the French countryside, Klaus's gunner, a boy named Eric, with sharp eyes, called out. A contact, moving fast along a tree line to their flank, nearly 1,000 meters out. Klaus swiveled his periscope. It was low to the ground, and it was moving with a speed he found baffling. It wasn't a half-track, and it certainly wasn't a lumbering Sherman. It was a blur of olive drab, kicking up a rooster tail of mud as it raced for a new position. Before Klaus could even give the order to traverse the heavy turret, a sharp crack echoed across the field, and the Panzer ahead of him, commanded by a friend from training school, shuddered violently. A plume of black smoke erupted from its engine deck. A second later, a flash of fire erupted from the mystery vehicle's long barrel. Then, in a way that defied all logic of armoured warfare, it was gone. It didn't reverse into cover. It didn't pivot and withdraw. It simply accelerated, vanishing behind a small rise with the agility of a scout car. Klaus and his crew sat in stunned silence. They hadn't even been able to lay their gun on the target. The enemy had fired and simply disappeared. Klaus keyed his throat mic, his voice tight with a confusion that bordered on anger. Did anyone see what that was? The only reply was static, and the distant, grim sound of a tank burning. They were baffled. They never knew a tracked vehicle with a gun that powerful could move like that. It was an encounter that made no sense, a violation of the fundamental rules of tank combat as they had learned them through blood and steel. This profound confusion, experienced by Klaus Richter and thousands of other Wehrmacht veterans on the Western Front, was not born in a vacuum. It was the product of a deeply ingrained military philosophy, one nurtured by years of successful blitzkrieg and reinforced by Nazi propaganda. The German way of war, especially armoured warfare, was a cult of technological superiority. The image of the Panzer, particularly the later heavy models like the Tiger and the Panther, was central to the identity of the Wehrmacht and the myth of German martial prowess. Propaganda newsreels and publications portrayed these machines as unstoppable steel behemoths, the pinnacle of engineering, operated by a new breed of Teutonic knight. Soldiers were taught that their equipment was the best in the world, a belief largely validated by their experiences in Poland, France, and the early years on the Eastern Front. Their doctrine was built around this concept of quality over quantity. A German Panzer was designed to be a fortress, a mobile gun platform that could absorb enemy fire from the front while destroying its opponents from a safe distance. Tank combat was envisioned as a duel, a showdown where the tank with the thickest armour and the most powerful, accurate gun would inevitably triumph. This philosophy dictated design. The Tiger I, with its slab-sided 100mm of frontal armour and legendary 88mm cannon was the embodiment of this idea. The Panther, its successor in many ways, incorporated sloped armor learned from encounters with the T-34, but maintained the core principles: heavy protection and a superior long-range gun. Crew training was rigorous and extensive, focusing on gunnery, tactical positioning, and the meticulous maintenance of their complex machines. A panzer commander was expected to be a master of this deadly arithmetic, calculating range, angle, and armor penetration to guarantee a kill before the enemy could even get close. Their view of the Americans was filtered through this same lens of arrogant superiority. They saw the M4 Sherman as the perfect symbol of the American approach: crude, mass-produced, and expendable. They knew the Americans could build thousands of them, but they laughed at its thin, vertical armor and its relatively weak 75mm gun. They couldn't believe that this was the best tank the world's greatest industrial power could produce. This disdain bred a dangerous confidence. They were prepared to fight an enemy who played by the same rules they did, an enemy who would line up their inferior tanks to be systematically destroyed by superior German guns and armor. They were utterly unprepared for an enemy who refused to play that game at all. What the German tankers, peering from the vision slits of their formidable machines, couldn't possibly grasp was that the strange, fleeting vehicle that struck them from the flank and vanished was the physical manifestation of a completely alien doctrine. The American military thinkers, particularly the head of Army Ground Forces, General Leslie J. McNair, had looked at the problem of defeating German panzers and had come to a radically different conclusion. McNair was a fervent believer in specialized roles. In his view, the job of an American tank, like the M4 Sherman, was to support the infantry and create breakthroughs. The job of fighting and killing enemy tanks, he argued, belonged to a new, dedicated branch: the Tank Destroyer Command. This command's guiding principle was not to out-armor the enemy, but to outmaneuver and outgun them. The core idea was to find the enemy, strike them with overwhelming firepower from an unexpected direction, and then rapidly move before they could retaliate. It was a doctrine built on speed, aggression, and ambush. This philosophy demanded a new kind of weapon, one that turned German design principles completely on their head. The result was the M18 gun motor carriage, better known by its nickname, the Hellcat. If the German Panther was a heavily armored knight on a charger, the Hellcat was an assassin with a stiletto. Its designers at Buick were given a simple, revolutionary directive: create the fastest tracked armored vehicle on the planet. To achieve this, they made a shocking trade-off, one that German engineers would have considered suicidal. They sacrificed armor. The M18 Hellcat had, at its thickest point, only 1 inch of steel plate. In many places, it was less than half an inch thick, barely enough to stop heavy machine gun fire, let alone an anti-tank shell. But this radical diet, combined with a powerful radial aircraft engine and a sophisticated transmission, gave the Hellcat its legendary speed. It could exceed 55 miles per hour on a good road, allowing it to outpace and outrun every other armored vehicle on the battlefield. It was this speed that was its primary weapon and its primary defense. Armed with a potent 76mm cannon, the same gun being fitted to upgun Shermans, it had the punch to kill Panthers and even Tigers, provided it could hit them in their weaker side or rear armor. The tactic that evolved from this machine was simple, audacious, and brutally effective: shoot and scoot. Hellcat crews were trained not to engage in slugging matches. They were to use their incredible speed to gain flanking positions, to appear where the enemy least expected them. A platoon of Hellcats would set up an ambush, wait for the German panzers to expose their flanks, and then fire a volley of armor-piercing rounds. The moment those shots were fired, before the stunned German crews could even traverse their slow, heavy turrets to find the source of the attack, the Hellcats would be gone, using their speed to race to a new, pre-planned firing position, ready to strike again from another angle. It was this aggressive, phantom-like tactic that so thoroughly baffled the Wehrmacht veterans. They were warriors trained for a decisive duel, and they found themselves being bled to death by an enemy who refused to stand and fight. They were stunned by an opponent who treated armor not as a shield, but as a burden. For the German tankers, peering out at a battlefield where the rules had suddenly changed. The M18 Hellcat wasn't just a new weapon, it was a terrifying, incomprehensible riddle. The German counterattack at Arracourt was meant to be a textbook armoured assault, a hammer blow to check the advance of Patton's Third Army. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and the men of the 113th Panzer Brigade, it was a familiar and welcome script. They were advancing in a staggered formation, a panzerkeil or armoured wedge, designed for mutual support and overwhelming firepower. The morning mist had burned off, replaced by a hazy autumn sunlight that glinted off the long barrels of their cannons. They were hunting Shermans, and confidence was high. The rolling terrain offered excellent fields of fire, and their intelligence reports indicated only standard American armoured companies in the area. The first sighting was almost comical. A lone, small vehicle darted from the cover of a distant copse of trees, moving parallel to their advance. Through his binoculars, Klaus watched it, a flicker of professional curiosity mixing with disdain. It was squat and had an open-top turret, a design feature the Germans considered an absurd vulnerability. It was so lightly armoured, he felt he could see the plates ripple as it sped over the uneven ground. Eric, his gunner, laughed derisively over the intercom. "Oberleutnant, is that a tank or a farm tractor with a pipe welded on it?" The sentiment was shared across the panzer net. Another commander radioed in, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Be careful. They are trying to distract us with their toy cars." They dismissed it as a reconnaissance vehicle, a nuisance to be swatted away later. Their priority was the American battle tanks they knew must be lurking ahead. They laughed at it. Until it stopped. For a fleeting second, the strange vehicle paused on the crest of a small hill, silhouetted against the sky. Then, another joined it, and another, and another. A pack of them. Before Klaus could process the geometry of the threat, the trap was sprung, a series of sharp, whip-like cracks, utterly distinct from the deeper boom of their own guns, echoed from their right flank. The sound was immediately followed by the terrifying, percussive clang of high-velocity tungsten rounds striking hardened German steel. It was the sound of a fist punching through a wall. Klaus watched in horror as the Panther to his right, commanded by a seasoned veteran of the Kursk offensive, simply ceased to exist as a fighting machine. A 76mm armor-piercing shell slammed into the thinner side armor of its turret, punching through with a flash of white-hot energy. The ammunition inside detonated a split second later. The turret, weighing over 12 tons, was lifted cleanly from its race and tossed a dozen feet into the air, tumbling end over end before crashing to the earth. A geyser of fire and oily black smoke erupted from the gaping hole in the hull. The radio, which had been filled with casual banter moments before, went dead silent, replaced by the horrifying hiss of an open channel and the screams of dying men. They were shocked. They couldn't believe what was happening. The moment of impact was a sensory cataclysm that shattered the sterile confidence inside Klaus Richter's Panther. The world outside his vision slits had been orderly, predictable, a chessboard upon which he was the queen. Now, chaos reigned. His mind, trained for the methodical process of long-range dueling, struggled to catch up. The attack had come from a direction they had considered secure. It had happened with a speed that defied their understanding of armoured tactics. His commander's instinct screamed at him. "Traverse right. Target. Flank. 900 meters." Erich, his young gunner, was already spinning the heavy turret traverse wheel, the electric motors whining in protest at the sudden demand. But it was like trying to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. By the time the Panther's formidable cannon was pointing towards the source of the attack, there was nothing there. The small, impossibly fast vehicles were gone. They had vanished back behind the hill, leaving only the burning wreck of a 45-ton Panzer as their calling card. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation for these battle-hardened veterans, began to seep into the fighting compartment. Another commander's voice, now strained and high-pitched, crackled over the radio. "They're on the other side. Left flank. Left flank." Klaus swiveled his periscope just in time to see a new volley of flashes from a completely different position. over 1,000 meters away on their opposite side. Another panzer shuddered to a halt, its tracks severed, a plume of white smoke indicating a coolant leak. The crew bailed out, scrambling for their lives as the strange, low-slung tank destroyers began to pour fire into their crippled vehicle. The German response was a picture of futile fury. They fired back, their powerful 75mm and 88mm guns sending high-explosive shells tearing into the hillsides where the enemy had been, but they were shooting at ghosts. The Hellcat crews had already scooted, using their incredible speed to race along pre-planned, defiladed routes to their next firing position. The Wehrmacht tankers were stunned. They were caught in a perfectly orchestrated crossfire. A Jägerschlacht, a hunter's battle where they were the prey. The very principles of their doctrine were being turned against them. Their thick frontal armor, which they had trusted to protect them, was rendered useless as shots rained down on their vulnerable sides and rears. Their powerful, accurate cannons, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, were worthless because their targets refused to offer a duel. The emotional whiplash was severe. Arrogance had curdled into fear. The feeling of invincibility was replaced by a gnawing, terrifying sense of helplessness. The Americans weren't fighting fair. They weren't fighting the way they were supposed to. They were treating armored warfare like a knife fight in the dark. And the Germans, for all their pride and power, had been caught completely, shockingly, unprepared. In the immediate aftermath of that first blistering volley, a stunned silence descended upon the surviving German crews. The air inside Klaus's Panther was thick with the acrid smell of cordite from their own desperate, unaimed shots and the metallic tang of fear. The comforting thrum of the engine now felt like a racing, panicked heartbeat. Through the periscope, the scene was one of disbelief. Two of the finest tanks in the German army, machines that cost a fortune in resources and man-hours to build, were now smouldering pyres on the French countryside. The confident advance had dissolved into a confused, static mess. Some panzer commanders, reverting to their training, began to reverse slowly, seeking cover. Others, enraged, pushed forward, firing blindly into the hills, wasting precious ammunition on phantoms. The command net was a cacophony of contradictory orders and panicked reports. "Where are they?" one voice pleaded. "I can't see them," shouted another. "Pull back! No, push forward and engage!" The crisp, professional discipline of the Panzerwaffe was cracking under the psychological strain. For Klaus, the world had been turned upside down. He had always known combat was dangerous, but it had followed a certain brutal logic. There were calculations of risk, armor thickness, and muzzle velocity. This was different. This was illogical. It felt like being attacked by specters, by an enemy who could strike with lethal force and then simply cease to exist. His worldview, forged in the fires of the Ostfront and reinforced by years of Nazi propaganda, was beginning to fracture. The Americans were not supposed to be like this. They were supposed to be the amateurish, quantity over quality army. They were supposed to line up their flimsy Shermans for slaughter. They were not supposed to be clever. They were not supposed to be this aggressive, this audacious. The vehicle they had laughed at just minutes earlier now seemed like the most terrifying weapon they had ever faced. It wasn't just its speed or its powerful gun, it was the doctrine behind it. A doctrine so alien, so contrary to their own, that it felt like a personal insult, a mockery of their martial tradition. As his driver skillfully maneuvered their Panther behind the relative safety of a stone farmhouse, Klaus took a moment to breathe, his heart pounding against his ribs. The initial shock was giving way to a cold, grim realization. This was not going to be the easy victory they had anticipated. A new and terrible variable had been introduced to the battlefield equation, and for the first time, fighting the Americans on the Western Front, Klaus Richter and his crew felt a profound, unnerving sense of dread. They never knew an enemy could fight like this. The horrifying events at Arracourt were not an anomaly, a lucky break for an otherwise outmatched opponent. For the German soldiers on the ground, this was the most difficult truth to accept. In the immediate aftermath, they rationalized, they explained it away as a clever one-time trick, a well-laid trap that wouldn't work again. But then the reports started to filter in from other sectors, from different panzer units engaged across the front. The stories were all hauntingly similar. A fast, low-profile vehicle, an attack on the vulnerable flank, a devastatingly accurate first shot, and then the vanishing act. What the Wehrmacht veterans couldn't believe was that this wasn't improvisation. It was a system. It was a cold, calculated doctrine that had been conceived and ruthlessly drilled into thousands of young American crews, thousands of miles away in the dusty plains of Texas. At the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, the mantra was not armor and firepower, but seek, strike, and destroy. American crews were taught to think like hunters, not brawlers. They spent endless hours studying tank recognition, not just to identify their targets, but to memorize their weak spots, the side armor of a Panther, the rear engine deck of a Tiger, the vulnerable turret ring. They were trained to see the terrain not as a series of obstacles, but as a web of opportunities. Every hill was a potential firing position, every ditch a concealed escape route. They drilled the shoot and scoot tactic until it was muscle memory. A platoon of 5 Hellcats would operate as a single predatory unit. The platoon leader would designate a primary and secondary firing position, as well as multiple escape routes, before the engagement even began. They would let the German panzers advance into a designated kill zone, waiting with disciplined patience. Then, on a single command, they would unleash a coordinated volley and, without even waiting to see the full effect of their shots, immediately race for their next position. It was a fluid, terrifyingly efficient system of mechanized guerrilla warfare, and for the Germans, who adhered to a rigid, almost stately philosophy of armored combat, encountering it was like a master swordsman being challenged to a gunfight. The shock of the first encounter soon gave way to the grim, grinding reality that this was the new norm. The days that followed the initial clash at Arracourt saw this new reality etched into the German consciousness with fire and steel. The men of the panzer brigades, now wary and on edge, attempted to adapt. They advanced with more caution, using infantry to screen their flanks. They tried to position their heavy tanks on ridges in an overwatch position to counter any flanking attacks. But they were trying to solve a new problem with old solutions, and the Hellcat crews were always a step ahead. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the battle became a waking nightmare. On one occasion, his company managed to corner a lone Hellcat in a small valley. They had it bracketed, with panzers covering both exits. It was a moment of grim satisfaction. Finally, they would force the Phantom to stand and fight. They began to pour fire down into the valley, but instead of surrendering or being destroyed, the Hellcat did something that defied all tactical logic. It turned towards them, its engine roaring, and accelerated directly at Klaus's lead Panther. The German crew, stunned by the sheer audacity of the move, fumbled to get a shot off. The Hellcat, moving at over 50 miles per hour, jinked and weaved between the shell craters, a ridiculously difficult target. It raced past the lead Panzer, its 76mm cannon spitting fire at near point-blank range, the shot ricocheting harmlessly off the thick frontal glacis. But the Hellcat wasn't trying to kill the tank. It was using its incredible speed to blow right through the cordon, weathering a storm of ineffective machine gun fire before vanishing over a hill. The German crews just sat there, their cannons pointing uselessly at empty space. They had the enemy trapped, and he had simply outrun them. They were left with nothing but the lingering smell of diesel exhaust and a profound sense of their own ponderous inadequacy. This pattern of shock and helplessness was not confined to the open fields of France. Months later, during the Battle of the Bulge, the same brutal lessons were taught in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes. Here, the German heavy tanks, the mighty Tiger IIs of the elite SS Panzer divisions, were at an even greater disadvantage. Their wide tracks and immense weight made them slaves to the narrow, icy roads, forcing them to advance in long, vulnerable columns. For the Hellcat crews of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion defending Bastogne, it was a perfect hunting ground. A German column, spearheaded by a 70-ton King Tiger, was inching its way down a winding forest road. The air was frigid, the towering pines heavy with snow. Suddenly, from a snow-covered ridge overlooking the road, a whip-crack sound echoed through the silent forest. The lead King Tiger shuddered as a 76mm round, fired from a perfectly concealed Hellcat, slammed into its side turret. While not a killing blow against such a monster, it was enough to damage the traverse mechanism. Seconds later, another crack, and the last vehicle in the column, an armoured half-track, erupted in flames, blocking any retreat. The column was trapped. What followed was a systematic execution. Hellcats, painted white for camouflage, darted between the trees, firing into the thin side and rear armour of the immobilised panzers, and then relocating before the Germans could even react. The panzer crews were reduced to terrified passengers in their own steel tombs. Their massive cannons could level a building, but they were useless against fleeting targets that appeared for only a few seconds at a time. All they could do was sit and listen for the next sharp crack, praying it wasn't aimed at them. Over time, the M18 Hellcat itself ceased to be the primary symbol of this new, terrifying American power. Most German soldiers never got a clear look at one. It was a blur of motion, a fleeting shape at the edge of their vision. Instead, the symbol, the thing that burrowed deep into their psyche, was a sound. It was the unique, high-velocity crack of the American 76mm cannon. It was a sound utterly different from the deep, guttural boom of their own 75mm and 88mm guns. It was sharper, faster, and it became the herald of an invisible death. For a Lanzer huddled in a frozen foxhole or a Panzer crewman peering through a periscope, the familiar rumble of a Sherman was almost comforting. It was a known threat that could be dealt with. The whistle of artillery was terrifying, but impersonal. But that sharp, singular crack, echoing from an unseen position on the flank, became the most dreaded sound on the Western Front. It was a sound that meant a hunter was watching them. It was a sound that was almost immediately followed by the percussive whump of a catastrophic explosion and the sight of another German tank transformed into a funeral pyre. This sound, the crack-boom signature of the Hellcat, represented the new reality. It was the sound of a war they couldn't understand, fought by rules they hadn't written. It was the sound of a systematic, relentless, and seemingly unstoppable force that was dismantling the myth of Panzer superiority. One shocking volley at a time, the persistent, panicked reports from the front lines could not be ignored forever. In the rear echelon headquarters of the Wehrmacht, far from the mud and smoke of Arracourt, the initial reaction to accounts of phantom-like American tank killers was one of deep skepticism. Generals and staff officers, men who had built their careers on the meticulous study of armoured doctrine, read the after-action reports with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. The descriptions sounded like battlefield hysteria, the exaggerations of green troops, or the excuses of failed commanders. A tracked vehicle that could travel at the speed of a staff car, a tank destroyer with paper-thin armour that actively sought out combat. It contradicted everything they knew about armoured vehicle design and tactical employment. Their own tank destroyers, the Panzer IV and the formidable Panther, were logical extensions of their core philosophy. They were turretless assault guns with incredibly thick frontal armour and a devastating main cannon, designed to ambush enemy formations from a prepared, hull-down position. The idea of a lightly armoured vehicle hunting panzers was tactically insane, a suicide mission. The High Command's initial assessment was that the troops were simply encountering upgunned M4 Shermans or the new M10 tank destroyer, a vehicle they understood and respected, but which was built on the slow Sherman chassis. The reports of impossible speed were dismissed, but as burnt-out Panthers and Tigers continued to litter the battlefields, and as consistent reports from veteran, highly decorated officers flowed in, the truth became undeniable. There was a new weapon on the field, one for which they had no answer, and, more alarmingly, no conceptual framework. Intelligence officers scrambled to identify the threat. Debris from destroyed M18s was analysed, revealing the shocking truth of their thin armour and powerful radial engines. Captured American documents confirmed the existence of a dedicated tank destroyer doctrine built around the principles of speed and ambush. The realization that dawned in the German High Command was a chilling one. The Americans hadn't just built a better tank, they had developed an entirely new and terrifyingly effective way of killing them. Faced with this asymmetric threat, the Wehrmacht did what any rigid, doctrine-bound military does. It tried to apply old solutions to a new problem. The first and most obvious response was to issue new tactical directives. Panzer spearheads were no longer to advance with their flanks exposed. They were ordered to be screened by infantry and accompanied by their own mobile anti-tank guns, like the towed Park 40 or the Marder self-propelled gun. The theory was sound: create a 360-degree screen of defensive fire to ward off the flanking Hellcats. In practice, it was a dismal failure. The screening elements simply could not keep up with the Panzers, and more importantly, they could not begin to match the speed and agility of the Hellcats. A Hellcat platoon could easily bypass a slow-moving infantry screen, strike the high-value tanks, and be gone before the towed anti-tank guns could even be unlimbered and brought to bear. Another desperate countermeasure was to assign their own more nimble tanks, like the Panzer IV, to act as dedicated bodyguards for the heavy Tigers and Panthers. These Panzer IVs were to watch the flanks and engage the American destroyers. This too proved futile. While more mobile than a Panzer IV was still no match for the Hellcat's raw speed. It was like sending a guard dog to catch a cheetah. The Hellcat crews could simply refuse combat with the escorts, bypass them, kill the primary target, and vanish. The Germans were forced into a reactive, defensive posture, their powerful armoured fists clenched in frustration, unable to land a blow. They even tried to use their own technological might to counter the threat, but their engineering philosophy was a gilded cage. They could not conceive of building something like the Hellcat, as it violated their deeply held belief in the supremacy of armour and gun over all else. Their answer to any armoured problem was always a bigger gun and thicker steel, leading to monstrous creations like the 70-ton Tiger II and the 188-ton Maus super heavy tank. These behemoths were formidable from the front, but they were logistical nightmares and even more vulnerable to the Hellcat's flanking tactics than their predecessors. They were dinosaurs, magnificent and powerful, but utterly unsuited to the new, fast-paced warfare the Americans had unleashed. The most profound impact of the Hellcat was not on the smouldering hulls of German tanks, but on the shattered nerves of the men who crewed them. The psychological toll of this new threat was immense, creating a pervasive sense of anxiety that came to be known among the troops as Jägerangst, hunter anxiety. It was a specific and corrosive type of fear. A German tanker on the Eastern Front feared the massive numbers of T-34 seconds, but it was a fear of being overwhelmed by a known quantity. He trusted that, one-on-one, his machine was superior. On the Western Front, the Hellcat destroyed this fundamental confidence. It wasn't about being outnumbered or outgunned in a conventional sense. It was the terror of being hunted by an invisible, faster predator. The psychological safety of the Panzer, the feeling of being protected by thick Krupp steel, evaporated. Crews who had once felt like knights in their castles now felt like men trapped in steel boxes, waiting for a fatal blow from an unknown direction. This fear began to manifest in crippling ways. Seasoned commanders became overly cautious, their advance slowing to a crawl as they scanned every tree line, every ridge, for a potential ambush. Gunners became jumpy, wasting ammunition on shadows and suspected targets. The constant, unrelenting stress was exhausting. Unlike a conventional tank battle, which was a period of intense action followed by a lull, the threat from the Hellcats was ever present. A crew could never relax. Every moment, they had to assume they were being watched, stalked. This constant state of high alert frayed nerves clouded judgment and led to fatal mistakes. The camaraderie inside the tanks soured into nervous tension. Every unexplained sound, every crackle on the radio, could signal an impending attack. The Americans had effectively placed a sniper behind every German tank on the battlefield, and the psychological weight of that was crushing. The proud Panzerwaffe, the conquerors of Europe, were being psychologically dismantled by a vehicle they had initially laughed at. They were forced to realize a truth their entire military culture was built to deny, that their superior technology, their rigorous training, and their martial pride were being rendered irrelevant by an enemy who simply refused to fight on their terms. The aggressive shoot-and-scoot tactic hadn't just broken their tanks, it was breaking their will to fight. The M18 Hellcat was not merely a successful weapon system, It was the physical embodiment of a philosophy of war that the German High Command was fundamentally incapable of understanding. It was a victory of pragmatism over dogma, of ingenuity over ideology. The German war machine, a product of a totalitarian state, worshipped the monolith. Its answer to every tactical problem was a bigger, thicker, more complex and awe-inspiring piece of hardware. The Tiger, the Panther, and the King Tiger were not just tanks. They were rolling cathedrals of steel, designed to overwhelm and intimidate, reflecting a national belief in inherent technological and martial superiority. They were weapons built to star in propaganda reels. The American approach, born from a democratic and industrial society, was entirely different. It was a culture of problem solvers. Faced with the problem of heavily armored German tanks, the American solution was not to build an even more gargantuan monster. Instead, they dissected the problem and designed a specific, efficient tool for the job. They recognized that the German Titans had a weakness, their ponderous nature. The Hellcat was the scalpel designed to exploit that weakness. It represented a uniquely American form of dominance, not the jackbooted dominance of conquest, but the quiet, terrifying dominance of industrial logic. It was the product of a system that could identify a need, rapidly design a solution, and then leverage its immense manufacturing base to produce that solution in overwhelming numbers. German veterans were baffled because they were defeated not just by a machine, but by the entire industrial and intellectual culture that had created it. They were stunned to find that the nation of shopkeepers they so disdained had produced a hunter of unparalleled lethality. This ultimate truth was demonstrated in the most brutal fashion during the winter of 1944–45 in the frozen, snow-draped forests of the Ardennes. Hitler's last great gamble on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge, was intended to be the final triumph of German armored might. Elite SS panzer divisions, equipped with the fearsome King Tiger, were to smash through the American lines and prove, once and for all, the superiority of their ideology and its weapons. For the crews of these 70-ton behemoths, it was to be their magnum opus. Instead, it became their graveyard, and the Hellcat was their undertaker. In the narrow, winding roads and dense woods, the King Tiger's strengths, its impenetrable frontal armor, and its long-range powerful cannon were almost completely negated. The battlefield itself conspired against them. For the Hellcat crews, however, these same conditions created the perfect hunting ground. In a climactic series of engagements around towns like Bastogne and Street, Vith, the final verdict on the two opposing doctrines was delivered. Imagine the scene. A column of SS King Tigers, the pride of the Third Reich, cautiously navigating a treacherous, ice-covered road, their massive engines groaning in the frigid air. They are blind, their vision restricted by the dense forest. Suddenly, from a snow-covered ridge, the sharp crack of a 76mm cannon echoes. The lead Tiger shudders as a high-velocity round smashes into its drive sprocket, immobilizing it. Before the stunned crew can even identify the threat, another crack from the opposite side of the road, and the last vehicle in the column erupts in flames, trapping the entire unit. The hunters had sprung their trap. What followed was not a battle, it was a dissection. Hellcats, their olive-drab paint hastily whitewashed for camouflage, emerged from the woods like wraiths. They refused to engage from the front. They used their speed to flank the column, to appear, fire a crippling shot into the thinner side or rear armor of a trapped Tiger, and then vanish back into the trees before the slow-traversing turret could even turn. The SS tankers, the supposed elite of the world, could do nothing. They were reduced to helpless frustration, firing their enormous 88mm cannons blindly into the forest, the muzzle blasts shaking snow from the pines, but hitting nothing but air. They were the most powerful tanks on Earth, yet they were being systematically dismantled by an enemy they could barely see. In the end, the story of the M18 Hellcat is a poetic reflection on the nature of power. The Wehrmacht believed power was concentrated, heavy, and absolute, symbolized by their magnificent but flawed panzers. They built their tanks as they built their state, a rigid, imposing facade of invincibility that was surprisingly brittle when struck from an unexpected direction. They couldn't believe that true power could be fluid, fast, and adaptable. The American reality they encountered was one where power was decentralized, where small, independent units were empowered by a doctrine that valued initiative and intelligent aggression over blind obedience. The Panther was a weapon designed for a war of annihilation, a testament to an arrogant belief in a master race. The Hellcat was a tool designed for a specific task, a testament to a pragmatic belief in getting the job done as efficiently as possible. For the surviving German veterans, men like Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the memory of that war would forever be haunted not by the endless waves of Shermans, but by the phantom they had once laughed at. In the quiet years after the war, they would finally understand. They had prepared for a clash of titans, a Wagnerian opera of steel and fire. Instead, they had been bled to death in 1,000 small cuts, administered by an enemy who refused to play by their rules. They never knew that their quest for the ultimate weapon would be rendered obsolete by a machine built not for a final, glorious duel, but for the simple, brutal, and relentless task of winning a war.